Joe, Richard, Juliet and Robin all have an autistic spectrum disorder, a lifelong disability that affects the way they're able to communicate and relate to people around them. We talk about the autistic spectrum as it can occur in differing degrees and in a variety of forms. The term Asperger's syndrome is used to describe more able individuals. Each individual on the spectrum will have common difficulties with social interaction, social communication and imagination. Another characteristic is a very repetitive way of behaving. People on the autistic spectrum can show very different levels of ability. The range can extend from those who have a learning disability right up to those who have normal or even above average intelligence. Before we look into the lives of Joe, Richard, Juliet and Robin, we will look at the characteristics in more detail. So firstly, how do people on the autistic spectrum display their problems with social interaction?
Early diagnosis is obviously crucial for the family, for the child and the family, because without an early diagnosis there can be no linking parents with other parents, no early intervention, and the family are left confused, frustrated and struggling with a child whose behaviour they don't understand.
Without a diagnosis, families may not be able to get the welfare benefits they have a right to or the respite care they need. For the person with autism, diagnosis is the key which unlocks appropriate services and support. Unfortunately, it is all too common that parents find it hard to get a diagnosis for their child.
Getting a diagnosis for Joe was such a struggle. I think in the end we saw about 10 different types of development paediatrician. I did come across many different doctors, health visitors, speech therapists, language therapists, occupational therapists, and it was so difficult to get a straight answer out of them. And I can remember on more than one occasion saying, "Is this child autistic?" And they said, "No, absolutely not, under any circumstances." And it's so confusing. But at the age of 4, we did get a diagnosis of autism, and we were able to pursue some early intervention for him.
There is presently no known cure for autism. There are, however, many ways of helping people with the disability. A variety of approaches and therapies are used, ranging from special diets to quite intensive forms of behaviour modification. While there is differing opinion as to the effectiveness of the approaches, it's widely agreed that the earlier the intervention, the better. Joe was diagnosed as a child and was able to get some early intervention. What are the benefits?
Early intervention helps children before school, and it bridges the gap between diagnosis and school placement. It's really important because it can help the child with autism achieve their full potential. It helps them learn and it can prevent behaviour problems developing. And there are various models around of early intervention. Research is trying to sort out which might work best, but we do know that early intervention is essential to help the child with autism. And we know that it's good to involve parents in early intervention, although some of the approaches work primarily with the child.
The NAS Early Bird project combines group training sessions for parents with individual home visits. Video feedback is used to help parents apply what they learn. The project is currently based in Barnsley, South Yorkshire, but there are plans to expand it across the country. At present, local child development centres, nurseries and portage services may be able to offer appropriate preschool intervention. If a child receives an early diagnosis, parents are in a better position to ensure their child is placed in a school appropriate to their needs. So, what is the ideal type of school for children with an autistic spectrum disorder?
The ideal school is a school that meets the child's needs. That sounds rather trite, but that means that the school might be any. It might be a mainstream school, it might be a unit attached to a mainstream school, it could be any of a variety of special schools, Or it might be more appropriate for a child to go into an autism-specific setting. Some parents choose to educate their child at home, and some will find the best place is perhaps in a local independent school.
Whatever the type of schooling, it's crucial that teachers have an understanding of autistic spectrum disorders and are aware of appropriate methods of teaching. Joe is a pupil at Radlett Lodge School in Hertfordshire. Here he follows a broad and balanced curriculum, but importantly he also receives extra help with his particular difficulties. The school is run by the National Autistic Society, who have developed an approach called SPELL to help people with autism develop to their fullest potential. The approach can be used in schools and adult centres. SPELL is an acronym. S stands for structure.
Eat. How many? Two. Good.
By structuring a child's day, we can help a child with autism to anticipate and understand what they're going to be doing next. For example, each child when they come to school has their own timetable, and we use objects, photographs, line drawings, symbols or words to help them to sequence their day. We also use objects and symbols and photographs at other sessions, for example at drinks time. If children aren't able to ask for a drink or a biscuit, rather than just letting them help themselves, we're really keen that children learn to communicate their need. So in a drinks time, they might have a piece of paper out with photographs or symbols of drinks and biscuits, and they have to actually give the symbol or the picture to a member of staff, often giving eye contact as well. And that's their way of saying, can I have a drink or a biscuit please?
Jasper wants tea.
P stands for positive.
We have positive expectations of the children here. When children start school, they have a thorough baseline assessment, and from there we plan objectives which they will work on in the coming year. We also celebrate children's achievements and they feel good about it. We take photographs and keep record of achievement folders. We may reward them with our smiley face sticker in their special book of progress, or use sweets as a reward for some children.
E is for empathy.
We try to get behind a child's wills and understand how they're feeling. We cope with all sorts of things that some children with autism find really difficult to cope with.
L stands for low arousal.
We try to keep our classrooms calm and as free from clutter as possible. Children with autism may get distracted by all sorts of things that we don't even notice. For example, certain noises, like a lawnmower going on outside, or if we use lots of language, it can be very distracting.
And some tape.
Odd things can be very stimulating to children. There's a child in my class at the moment who loves rubber. So the rubber doormat is absolutely fascinating, and we've had to remove that for the time being.
L is for links.
Links with parents in particular are extremely important when teaching children with autism. They've got a wealth of information to share with us. Links with professionals are extremely important too. For example, if a child has respite care, it's very useful for their key workers from the respite care centre to come in and see how we do things and to try to get some consistency.
Autism is a lifelong disability. However, it is important to stress that people on the autistic spectrum can develop. A child at the less able end of the spectrum who, over the years, is given the right services and support may well grow up to be an adult who displays more subtle signs of the disability. Juliet and Richard are young adults. They live in their own homes with 24-hour support from trained staff. What is life like for Juliet and Richard?
Here is where I live now, and I love it very much. And it's my own little house. At least here I can do a lot what I can, and so I'm very, very independent, really. And so I buy my own shopping, I do most of the housework myself, and I have sometimes a support worker who comes to see if I'm all right here.
It's quite a nice little house. It's got virtually everything that I need. It's got all that you'd expect: a living room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms upstairs, one for me and one for the person that's sleeping in. My feelings about this living arrangement are that it's perfectly suited to all my needs. Yeah, I can live here for a while. Yeah, you know, staff will help me. I'm doing my GCSEs at the moment, and I get plenty of time in it to, you know, sit down in my room and study them quiet.
At other times when I'm at home, I like to write letters and I read lovely books. And I really enjoy my bedroom upstairs because it's so cosy.
Well, occasionally in my spare time, I do like to, you know, play a bit of Scrabble, because I do find that helps me with my English. And also, you know, obviously, like most people watch a bit of television. I especially like viewing, like, you know, Dispatches on Channel 4, Panorama on BBC One, you know, programmes which are really informative, yeah, and educational at the same time.
While there is no medical test for autistic spectrum disorders, the characteristics can usually be recognised in the early years. Concerned parents often turn to their GP or health visitor. What should these professionals look for?
The first thing that the GP and the health visitor should do is listen to the parents. Parents are not going to go to a professional unless they have genuine concerns. Some of the sorts of things they should be listening to is, I think my child might be deaf, doesn't respond to his name, but he can hear the Thomas the Tank Engine video quite easily from the other room. My child hits out at other children in playgroup. He's different. I don't feel he's like my other children. So it's these sorts of things that the GPs and health visitors should be alerted to, and then refer on. If they're not sure, just refer on to the experts.
Good, keeping it nice and clean and tidy. That's right. Never ending.
On Fridays, I go riding for about half an hour, and the name of my pony is called Patch, and I love him dearly. He's a lovely pony.
Are you going to go and say hello?
Yeah, sure. They feel all right.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah? We'll just walk you away from the mountain block so we can check the girls.
Yes.
The types of social interaction can vary from those children and adults who are very aloof, cut off, and not really interested in any kind of social interaction, to those who are passive, who are happy for others to initiate contact, but once the person moves off, they revert back to their own individual world. And those who are making social contacts, but it's a very repetitive, active, inappropriate type of social communication. If we move on then to communication, similarly we have different manifestations along the spectrum. There are a proportion of children and adults who don't speak at all, who don't use language, and they will perhaps have their needs met maybe by taking you along to an object or person, depending what they want. Then you have those who do have maybe phrased speech and some simple form of language and communication, but it isn't elaborate in any way. And then, of course, we have the very chatty individuals who I've already mentioned in terms of their social interaction, who will talk at you and over and asking the same repetitive questions like, what is your age, what sort of car you got, those sorts of things. So, and then right at the very end of the spectrum, perhaps the more subtle end, which fits in more with the Asperger group, we have those people who communicate in a very pedantic, very stilted and very literal way. Now, what's interesting with all of them, all the types of communication difficulty, understanding of language is markedly more problematic than use of language. And people can be quite misled by somebody who's very talkative when really they have very limited comprehension. Imagination can also vary along the spectrum, from those who have no imagination at all, no pretend play in the children, to those who are what we call the copiers, that they watch other children carefully and they can copy play, which gives an impression of imagination, but in fact is not truly imaginative. And those who have a very seemingly rich fantasy life, but the problem is the separation of reality from fantasy, and is not really what we call true imaginative thoughts and feelings. And finally, the repetitive behaviours also can vary from the very simple stereotyped hand flapping, jumping, tiptoe walking, and in some cases head banging, right through to elaborate routines, or maybe arranging objects in straight lines and getting very upset if things move, to the more intellectual interests of the Asperger group, the circumscribed interests, maybe the movement of the planets, or species of carrots, or cooling towers, or I mean there are a whole range of special interests. One of the favourite ones is dinosaurs. That seems to be, and of course for the younger children, Thomas the Tank Engine.
Without specialist support services, people with autism and Asperger syndrome have great difficulty finding and holding down jobs. It's often because they fall at the first hurdle, which is the interview, and this requires such advanced social and communication skills that they find it extremely difficult to actually get through that stage of the recruitment process. When people do get into work, colleagues often perceive them as rude or obstructive or inflexible in some way, but that's usually because the person with autism doesn't understand other people's expectations.
I'd been working for 20 years before I got a diagnosis, all of which was in full-time employment. I had problems in my relations with colleagues. My main problem was I didn't keep on top of the work. So that I was inclined to lose my concentration. I couldn't keep working all day, and then I would lose the thread of the work, so that I didn't know, I wasn't on top of the work, and I wasn't quite as aware as I should have been of what ought to be done. Also, I wasted time as well, a lot of unproductive time.
Robin has always worked in the civil service. Since his diagnosis, he's been able to access a supported employment service specifically for people on the autistic spectrum.
A support worker from Prospect has helped me a very great deal. He is able to point out any problems that I have in my work, and also any problems can be discussed and raised with my line manager, or my line manager can raise problems with me without anybody feeling embarrassed about it, in a way perhaps he wouldn't feel able to do if I didn't have a support worker.
People with autism and Asperger syndrome have many marketable skills, and employers have commented on their accuracy, their reliability, and their performance at technical tasks is usually excellent. One example is an individual who worked in a pharmacy and was counting out medication for prescriptions, and he was the first person they'd ever had who was 100% accurate in his job.